Greetings and welcome to the basement. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the bare bones basics of using Playmaker in a project. Not going into any great depth here, just a real quick look at the minimum level of how do you use Playmaker. So to start off with, you do need to make sure that you have your Playmaker Editor window open, and you are going to want to have an Actions browser as well. To get these windows open, you can go to Playmaker and open up the Playmaker Editor window here, and the Action browser can be found through Editor windows. Once you have those in place, you're good to go. Now, in order to actually add a state machine to something, we have to have a game object selected. I am going to make a cube rotate. It's kind of sort of the hello world, I suppose, of game engines. So I'm going to create a cube here. I'm going to make sure my cube is created at the origin, and it's not. You always have to watch this for Unity. It loves to create things in weird and wonderful places. So I am going to reset the transform on that cube, so that way it's in the center of the world. Switching back over to my Actions menu in the Playmaker Editor, I am now ready to add in a state machine here. So right-click to add state machine. Well, that's pretty simple. You can also, by the way, directly add a state machine by being on the inspector, adding a component, and adding in a Playmaker FSM. This will also get a state machine added onto an object and allow you to use it. Now it is worth noting that you can add as many of these as you darn well please. And there are reasons as to why you would want to have multiple state machines on a single game object, but in the general sense, this is not a good idea. If you have multiple state machines, you probably should have multiple game objects. Although, like I said, there's definitely scenarios in which you would do something like this. I do not, in fact, want multiple state machines right now, so I am going to click on the little ellipse here and remove the components. So I am back down to a singular state machine. And as you could see there, since I added it this way, I had to click off and back onto the object for this Playmaker window to update. And just sort of to prove the point, if I remove a component and right-click, add state machine, there we go. Everything's added in correctly. Now, once you have a state machine added onto a game object, you get some additional options up over here. It will always default to looking at the State tab of a state machine, but there's some other interesting stuff here. The FSM is just sort of general state machine information and pretty much just repeats what's available over here in the inspector. I would strongly advise that you always rename your state machines. Because if you have multiple state machines and they are all called FSM, and you are trying to pass information between these multiple state machines, all called FSM, you have fun with that. It's not going to be happy fun times for you. So you are going to want to rename this. Now, I will typically leave the FSM prefix on the state machine name just as a way of reminding myself that when I'm looking through text and stuff like that, that, oh yeah, this is a state machine. Templates, we'll deal with it another time. I would also recommend you put in a description here. You might think at the time of creating the state machine, it's like, oh, I'll never forget that. No, you will. You'll come back to it in a day and you'll be like, okay, I mostly remember what I was doing. You'll come back to it after 2 or 3 days and it'll be like somebody else wrote it. It'll be an alien thing that just sort of exists in your project. You come back to it after like 2 weeks, it's like, it's gone. It's out of there. So I strongly recommend you always put in a description. The State tab, of course, will always show all of your available states. Events shows the various events that the state machine is using, which are used for transitions. And variables shows all of the variables associated with this specific state. Or, I'm sorry, with this specific state machine. Coming over back here to state, you will notice that in my state machine, it starts me off with this start block and this state 1. This start block here, this solid black rectangle, is what's called a global event. It is something that no matter where you are, it will cause a transition to a specific state. All of these terminologies are very important, by the way. You have transitions, you have states, and you have global transitions. In this particular case, it's kind of a no-brainer. The start event is fired, and you transition to this state. Obviously, because the state machine just started, right? There's no place else you could be. But this is basically your starting point. Again, I would strongly recommend that you rename your states. Because as you create states, by default, most of the time, they're going to be called State 2, State 3, State 4. And by the time you get up to, say, oh, I don't know, State 25, it's going to get a little messy trying to keep track of all of them. So again, strongly recommend that you rename your states. I generally tend to call my states based on what is the primary thing that this state is handling. Now, all states are going to have, well, I should say most states, not all, most states are going to have a transition on them. An event is going to happen, and that event is going to trigger a transition to another state. So if I right-click on this state here, I can go to Add Transition, and there are a list of transitions here that I can use. Finished is one of the defined transitions, and we have a bunch of system events, and then I have a bunch of UI events. Finished is a very common event. The finished event is triggered when all of the actions of a state have completed, with some exceptions which we'll get into in later videos. Upon having an event, I need to actually hook this up as a, define what does this transition to. I have a couple of ways of doing it. In order to create new states, you saw me do it quickly earlier, I can right-click in this gray background area here and select Add State. Another way of doing it, if I have a transition that I need to define, I can press and hold the Control key, and then do a left drag. Notice I'm getting an arrow out of here. Release, and it will create a state. If I just left-click, drag, and release, it will not create a state. If I Control left drag, it will create a state. I can also left-click, drag to any state to indicate where it transitions to, including itself. This is perfectly valid for a state machine for it to define a transition back to itself. Now, there are gotchas that you got to watch out for this. When you do this, we'll deal with those later. If I want to completely clear out a transition, I can right-click on the event in question and say clear transition target. I can also clear transition event, which basically says, yeah, there's a transition here, but I haven't defined what event it uses, which is kind of a silly thing to do, to be quite honest. And then finally, if I've decided that I don't need this event transition at all, I can right-click on it and I can say delete transition, which just completely gets rid of it altogether. Navigating in this space is primarily done by holding the middle mouse button, which will enable you to pan. You can also mouse wheel to zoom out, and you can mouse wheel to zoom in, although that is the extent to which you can zoom out and zoom in. You can select a state with a left click, or you can select multiple states with left click drag. In order to select a state, you have to completely encompass it. Notice state 3 is not completely selected, so it doesn't end up in the selection. To delete states, I can just hit the delete key. You can also right-click on a state and say delete. Let's deal with actions now. In your action browser, you're going to have different information depending on what you have done. So your recent is going to be populated with whatever your recent action history has been across all projects. This is something that Unity tracks in its global preferences. So these are the various things that I have used across all different projects. You will also have a favorites category, which I haven't bothered adding anything to this category yet. And then you will have all the various categories that come with the default installation of Playmaker. It can be very useful sometimes to browse through these. For example, if you know that there's something that you want to do, but you're not quite sure what it might be called. Like I know I want to get mouse input. Obviously, that's going to be an input, but I'm not really sure what I'm looking for. So I can expand out input and see all of the different actions that are associated with the input group. You can also search for things. This search is a quasi... and I am suddenly spacing. There we go, regular expression. Momentarily blanked out on that term. This is a quasi-regular expression search in that it will find the matching letters anywhere in the string. So searching for rot, the beginning of rotation, brings up rotate, or rotate GUI, get quaternion from rotation all the way there towards the end. And you know what, if I, like say, just put in a TION, I am now finding everything that has an ION in its action name, which is quite a bit, including UI on, interestingly enough, just sort of ignoring that space in there. So the search feature is very powerful, assuming you can intuit what the thing is called, which isn't always possible. In this particular case, I know that I want rotate. Why do I know that? Well, if I want to spin a cube around, that's modifying the transform property of the game object. So I search for rotation. Oh, here we go. Transform. What do I got? I got to get rotation, rotate, set random rotation, and set rotation. Clicking on rotate, or any action for that matter, will get you a quick little description of what it does and a little preview of the various options that it has. In this case, rotates a game object around each axis. Excellent. That's exactly what I need. How do we use it? A couple of ways. I can double click. This will insert it into the bottom of the state list of whatever state that I currently have selected. If I do not have a state selected and I double click it, nothing happens. Come back over here. You can see I still just have one. By the way, you can have multiple copies of a state, or I'm sorry, of an action. Should you end up with too many or an action that you no longer want, you can click on the gear sign and do a remove action. You can also press the delete key. Another way to get an action in is to drag it, which will also add it in. And I can also drag it out into the state machine area where it will automatically create a state, name the state after the action, and put the action in this list here. When you are looking at an action for Playmaker, you've got a couple of different options. These are obviously drop-down boxes, and you can select your options through there. Now, sometimes you will see these two little bars off to the side, and sometimes you will not. For example, in the case of game object here, use owner, which refers to the owning game object, which would be the cube. I could also specify an object, and now I have the ability to specify a game object, which I can drag in from the scene, which I don't know why I would exactly want to do that. Or I could even specify a variable here, which I'm going to switch this back to use owner. Vector, you notice I have just the option of doing a new variable or a new global variable or setting it to none. But with the angles, I have these little sidebars here. This means that I have the option of hard entering in a value. Now I want to do this on the Y. Again, when you're thinking about what axis to rotate things on, think about the little widget here. And where do you want this spinning around? Well, I want this spinning around the Y axis. In other words, it's coming up through there, so I want it spinning around like this. Mouse behave. And so I could click this button, and now I have the ability to enter in a number. So I'm going to say 25, which is degrees. Coming down here, I've got some additional checkboxes. A quick note on the per second and the every frame options. If you have something marked every frame, and there's a number involved, you are going to want to make sure that that number is also marked as per second. Otherwise, if I don't mark this as per second, I am saying do this rotation at 25 degrees per frame, which is probably not what I want. More detail on that in other videos. So I'm going to mark this as per second. I'm going to mark this as every frame. I'm good to go. I can hit the run button. And I get a very, very slowly turning cube. I could, of course, come back over here and modify this and make it faster. Or I can put this into a variable. What are the advantages of putting this into a variable? Well, first of all, how do we create a variable? I could either come over here, click in the new variable box here, type in a name, type in a specification, or honestly, if you're feeling lazy, which most of the time I am feeling lazy, I can just come here and say, oh, I want a new variable, and I'm going to call you rotation speed. And that'll create a variable with the correct data type. Now, a very common newbie mistake, and honestly, I still make this mistake sometimes because I'm not paying attention, is to convert from a hard-coded number to a variable, hit the run button, and it's broken. It's not rotating. Why are you not rotating? You were just rotating. Variables broke it. Variables are terrible. Well, no. Remember, computers are dumb. They do exactly what you told it to do. If I come back over here to Playmaker, let's go to my Variables tab. I now have a variable in here since I created it. And keep in mind, variables, just regular old variables, are per state machine. If I select this variable, oh, value 0. Yeah, that would do it. That would do it. I can put that back in. Now, what's the advantage of doing this? Well, let's say I've got multiple cubes that I want to all rotate at the same speed. I can use this variable. I mean, if I just have 3 cubes, okay, fine, whatever. That's easy to fix. What if I had 50 of them in my level and I wanted to update the speed? I would not want to go through and find all 50 cubes and update their speed. Now, I want to come here and find the one variable that defines their rotation speed and update that. And I don't even want to go into Playmaker to do this. I'm lazy. I want to be in the scene and going around and have the inspector up because I'm working with other game objects, and I want to select this cube and I want to change its speed value. I can do that with a variable. So I'm going to come over here to Playmaker, and there's this little checkbox right here, Inspector. If that is checked, let the UI refresh there. If that is checked, if I look at this object in the inspector, and I come down here to controls and expand it, oh, hey, look at that. I now have my rotation speed, and better yet, it's now really easy to change it on the fly while things are running. So I can come in here, it's like, nope, that's too slow. I'm going to left click and drag. Yes, my mouse cursor just wrapped around the screen. I love the fact that Unity does that. And I'm going to crank this sucker up. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm rotating, more than one full rotation per second. There we go. That's a nice spinny, spinny little cube. Now, obviously, there is a lot more to using Playmaker than just this. But at its core, that is the core of using Playmaker. You add a state machine to an object, you add in states, you add in transitions, although I didn't really do transitions in this one, and define additional states with additional transitions, so on and so forth. And I'm not going to hit run because this would not do anything. And if you found this video useful, a like would be very much appreciated. And if it wasn't useful to you at all, well, the dislike button is right next to it. And so, until next time.